Okay, great. So I'd like to call to order I'm always caught for the date, Thursday, March 11th, 2021, Policy and Education Subcommittee meeting. Our first order of business is the approval of minutes from our March 4th, 2021 meeting. The minutes were in our packet. So, Mr. Chafe, any question about the minutes or comments?
No.
Okay.
No.
I will make a motion to approve the minutes.
Second.
All right, roll call vote, Mr. Chafe.
Aye.
And I vote aye, so the minutes are approved. Now I will pass it to Mr. Lee.
Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Dolan. Again, for this evening, we wanted to walk you through an overview of the early report. The early report is one that we had done as a school system to evaluate our special education services. And with us tonight, we have Dr. Petra Platt, Dr. Milo Kippingham, and Jeff Rubin to kind of give you an overview of the findings of that report and to provide you some context in terms of what it means and what we actually have already been working on related to many of the items that are in there. So I'm going to turn it over to whoever's going to speak. It might be Milo. So.
Okay, no, I'm going to begin.
Oh, sorry.
I'll bring her into it. So just as a background to it, first of all, this is, as the slide says, this evaluation was just done on preschool, kindergarten, and elementary special education classes and programs. So just a couple of things before we begin. I'm not sure how familiar everyone is with special education and the oversights that we go through. But this, as Jim had mentioned, this report was asked for by Dr. Hackett and us and paid for by the district. Periodically, you're required to do that. The state, the Department of Education, also comes in every 3 years and evaluates us. And there is a difference between their evaluation and an independent private evaluation such as this one. When the state comes in, and in fact, coincidentally, we just finished with our last review this week. That review, when the state comes in, when the Department of Ed comes in, they're looking at compliance issues, whether we are following every one of the regulations or many of the regulations, the federal and state regulations. Things like, for example, if we are completing evaluations within 30 days of receiving permission to evaluate a student and 45 days to have the meeting. That's just one example out of hundreds. But this report digs much deeper into it. So it really puts you under a different kind of microscope in a way. It's looking at programs, and one of the slides you'll see in a second goes over how they do it, or how Dr. Early did it. So with that said, there's 100 pages approximately in 2 sections of this report. As I mentioned, the preschool and kindergarten and the grades 1 through 5. So this is just really an overview, a quick overview for that matter, of some of the more important points, and just to summarize it. I know that the subcommittee has the full reports, so obviously you can read those. So, you know, I'm not going to read every note to everyone, but just to go over the rationale, this is why, you know, why we've done this, and some of the general areas that were looked at. So just the identification of trends and patterns on how we're referring students, how we're identifying them, how our programs are, how we deliver instruction in these programs, our staffing model and the responsibility of staff. And that's something I'm going to highlight as we get further on into this, because one of the big reasons, or major reasons, I should say, for asking for this eval is that at the secondary level, we have team chairs at both middle schools and the high school. At the elementary level, we don't have the responsibilities are handed out to the teachers and the specialists. When I say responsibilities, special ed is basically in two major parts: the delivery of services and educating students and providing therapies, and the legal part. We have to set up meetings, we have to evaluate kids, we have to write IEPs, and many other things that go along with that. And our special educators are pretty much responsible for that. And at the elementary level, the testing of students. At the secondary level, at the high school in particular, we have someone that's hired to do all of the academic testing. The psychological testing is obviously done by the school psychologists. At the elementary level, the psychologist does that part of it, but the academic testing is all done by the special educators. That takes time and out of their teaching responsibilities. So a little bit more on that in a minute or a few minutes. The identification of emerging student populations. I want to emphasize this because our demographics are changing. And the severity of some of the disabilities we're dealing with and working with are becoming much more severe. One of the highlights of Dr. Early's report in two parts of the recommendations, not one, talks about students with social, emotional, and behavioral issues. We're seeing more and more of that, anxiety, and more severe emerging behavioral and emotional disabilities. And this year isn't helping that any. Students are showing more and more anxiety for reasons that are well discussed in the media and, in the community. Okay, can you go to the next slide now? Okay, so the next one is, I'm not going to read this, just this talks about how they went about this. Just as a difference between when the state comes in, they're not going into classrooms. They're not observing. They're not doing, they do some surveys, but not to the depth, in depth the way it was done here. So again, they're walking through programs, they're speaking to people, they're interviewing people, they interviewed staff, they interviewed parents. When the state comes in, when the Department of Ed comes in, especially this year, but they're not doing any of that. They're just looking at file information, basically. Or as I mentioned before, are we out of compliance with any of the major areas in multiple areas that we have to be in compliance in? So just with this, you can see it's a much more in-depth evaluation. Go to the next slide, please. So again, here accommodations, what we're doing well, or what they felt we were doing well. And one of the things I want to, I'll explain some of it, but it's the last bullet that I'm most interested in this area. So, they're talking about, how inclusive philosophy means that we're required to, and we try to provide our services in an inclusive environment, not pulling kids out, bringing them to an office down the hall, although we do that with some students because we have to for a variety of reasons. But they're commending us because of our inclusive philosophy. Now, the next one, district-wide continuum of specialized disability category programs currently in place. What we've done, in the past number of years, we've started a large number of new programs in district. And what that does is we're providing services and programs for a large group of students that have more severe disabilities. And what that accomplishes is two things. It avoids out-of-district placements, which are, most parents do not want their children to go to programs in some far-off community because we don't have our own program. So we've started many programs, especially at the elementary level, for students on the autism spectrum in particular, as that population grew, and students with severe disabilities, which we started at Flaherty and moved up to the middle and high school level. The staffing of programs, we staff those programs based on need, not on, the number of students in any particular program. Now, the next bullet there, staff-based, school-based staff made efforts to maintain the response to intervention. And there'll be more about that on one of the other slides. But a lot of what we're trying to do and what we're required to do is provide services for students before they're referred for special education. The idea here is that many students have weaknesses, academic weaknesses, let's just say. And the idea is not to refer them right to special education for evaluation to determine if the student has a disability. And there's a lot of reasons why that becomes burdensome and not necessary. You might have a student, for example, in second grade that is struggling with learning to read. And instead of a quick referral to special education, response to intervention means that student might be seen by a special educator, but not under an IEP or a reading specialist in a small group. They might pull them out instead of them being in a classroom and providing more instruction in reading. For a lot of students at second grade start to pick it up. By third grade, they really start to, learn to read and move on. But some kids are slower at that. It might not mean that they have a disability. So we give them a little bit more or a lot more in some cases. And that might be they get some speech services, but not through an IEP, through what's called response to intervention, which by definition, we're seeing if the student is responding to a deeper intervention, not just a regular class instruction. Reasonable caseloads for teachers and therapists, that's been a thing in Braintree forever. And that goes for class size. I'm sure everyone in the school committees pretty much knows about what we try to do for class size. But in special education, we're able to go up to larger classes, by law, by regulation, but we keep them, pretty small. Pull-out classes or 6, 7 students. We're allowed to go up to 12, in some cases up to 16 with a teacher and 2 para-educators. We never go up to 16. So we keep class sizes small. Now, dedication of staff with good longevity. I talk about this all the time. I actually talked about this to the representative from the Department of Education I was talking with this week, the guy that did our review just recently. Braintree has a very dedicated staff. A lot of our teachers have gone to live in Braintree, grew up in Braintree, went to school in Braintree, come back, work for us. I like to say almost in a joking manner, once someone gets a job here, they don't leave until they retire, basically. We don't have a lot of turnover, I believe, especially in my department. People like it here, and that really helps a lot. And that was one of the accommodations, obviously. Okay, the next slide, please. Now, these are areas of recommendation, and you really have to read the full report to get the gist of it, because there's many, many pages in there. but these are areas that he's recommending we look at. Now, many of these we know about, probably all of them we know about. Some we've already started, and we were way before we had this evaluation, we're talking about trying to do certain things that they saw pretty easily. And I'll just run through them briefly here. The identification and referral process. They talk a lot about that, and they made some recommendations that I don't think would be something we would want to do here. And it's too much to go into now, but they talk about more of a centralized system. Parents in Braintree like their community elementary schools. That would mean we would take that process out of those individual schools and centralize them. I'm not sure that would be a thing that we would do in Braintree. The tiered support provision, I'll talk about that a little bit later, but just in brief, the support system is supposed to be done in 3 tiers, 1, 2, and 3. Talk about that a little bit further on. Staffing recommendations, it's talked about in the report, but the main thing here that I would like the school committee to take away, and it has huge budgetary issues. I've worked in other school districts, and there are no other school districts I've ever worked in or heard of that do not have what we call team chairs at every school. And that's what I was referring to before a little bit. It means that all the responsibilities for setting up the meetings, sending out the paperwork, putting the meetings together, and running those meetings, and all that entails is done by the same teacher that your children have. So it takes them out of class time. It's just everything. And when I say everything, it's burdensome to responsibilities. Not only do we have teachers that have to teach, but they have to do all this prep, and at the elementary level, as I mentioned before, they have to do the academic testing as well. So, that's really something else. And that's something that the district should work towards. It probably can't happen all at once. There are, I think, a recommendation or 2 in the report that talks about at least have 2 team chairs at the elementary level and let the schools split them. But, that's for a later time, after, what we keep hearing about budget and we know is a stress, that would be, have to be budgeted for. Professional development, we know we always need more and more professional development. More and more has been done each year. Dr. Milo is going to talk about something in a minute that talks a little bit more about professional development and programming recommendations, and that has to do with more on-site supervision. The next slide, please. Now we know in Braintree, this has been here, and people that are involved in it know, we have a high percentage of our students have IEPs and special education services. Since I've been in Braintree about 8 years now, we've always been about 21 to 22% of our students have IEPs. The state average is about 18. Some districts are much higher. Most districts are, in the teens, high teens. But we know we have a high percentage of students with IEPs. And that's because in a lot of cases, students struggling in reading, there's nowhere, we have reading specialists, but sometimes they go, right to special education. Centralized evaluation process to a single team. So in this case, I'm not sure how much we would centralize the evaluation process. As I said before, we do it by school now, and we would have to really take a better look at that. Intake review teams at each building. The reports talk about having teams look at how we intake the referral process. We're not doing that more centrally, and at each school, it's done a little bit differently. And the report talks about developing entry and exit criteria for programs and services. We probably don't want to necessarily do that. We want to be more flexible in how students come in and out of special education services. And I think the report talks about, I know the report talks about, if a student is making progress in, say, speech, and they test out of it, a lot of times parents will disagree with that, and they won't, they'll just, refuse to do that, and they have every right to do that, and they continue on with speech, for years on end sometimes. So in the next one is developing criteria for out-of-district referrals. When I started in Braintree, we had over 100 students in out-of-district placements. Now we run about 75 students every year. It goes up and down a little bit. It hasn't decreased. Once in a while, it'll go below 70 students, but out-of-district placements, as the school committee knows, is super expensive. I don't know how we would develop certain criteria. It's an individual basis that has to be done. And I think we're pretty good at that, determining who would go out of district and why. And it's not done, easily. And there's a lot of meetings, and it's only when we have a student that has a disability, and sometimes it's deteriorated to the point where we cannot, we just don't have the right program for that student in district. So I don't know if we could put anything in writing for a criteria for that. Consistent transition protocols between grades, in buildings, centralized timelines, electronic record sharing, and referral process. So, we really have that, pretty much up and running. I don't know, Dr. Milo, do you want to talk a little bit about that? And we also have, Peter Platt on this, who might be able to help discuss this one.
Sure. We've created some timelines in which to make referrals between buildings. We've set up a system of sharing treatment plans, service delivery, etc., between the servicing providers in one building to the next, and a referral process for programs between the grades. And now those are set up preschool through ninth grade, because ninth grade is the last transition year. They pretty much stay at the high school after that. Mr. Rubin, would you like me to continue with the screening process at the preschool level?
Yeah.
Okay. We did have a recommendation to pilot a group screening process at the preschool level. We currently screen our role model students individually. And there is some benefit to screening children at that age in a group to see what their group learning ability is, which you wouldn't see in an individual screener. Unfortunately, we weren't able to pilot that this year because of COVID. So that's definitely something that we will give a shot in the upcoming months, hopefully, when we're able to do more groups.
Okay. Can you go to the next slide, please? Okay, tiered support provision. There's been a lot done on this. This is really a system that has been put in place, and it has to do with what it's called tiered support provision, which just means instead of a student being referred for special education evaluation and to determine if they would need services, we do something called tiered support provision, and it goes in these stages. So a student that might be having some trouble in reading, we do these interventions before they're referred for special education. So they might get, for example, some reading support for even for a whole year. And if they still don't make progress with that kind of support, and that's just one example, then they might be referred for special education evaluation. And the third tier is really just having an IEP. So this is something the state has put in place, and it works really well. There's some schools that are doing it more thoroughly than others, just because there's a real time constraint with this one. Go to the next slide. Okay. Professional development. So this is something that we're always working on. How do we provide training that for staff throughout the year? It's increased dramatically, I'd want to say, in the last several years. We're going into this more and more now. Part of this, and I'll just run through these bullets here: IEP writing, and these are we're constantly trying to train in that, and how to write IEPs so that they are easier to read for parents and make more sense, and to have parents involved more in the process. The increased use of and continuity of data collection. Data, that's what we've been doing, and that's what we're doing in all areas. Now, I'm going to let Dr. Milo speak about the next bullet in particular, because she's been working through this and done a lot of work in this area.
This year, one of the things we did as part of the evaluation is that we were able to get an early intervention coordinator, which used to be encompassed in my position, and now I am out in the elementary schools. And one of the needs also addressed in the report is supports for our kiddos that have socio-emotional and behavior differences. And one of the focuses for professional development was how to serve these youth. We've been exploring several mediums, but a very promising one is through the Massachusetts Partnerships for Youth. And that's an organization of professionals from across the state that have come together and developed professional development specifically for the issues that are relevant in schools presently. And that might range from things like special education delivery to socio-emotional interventions to the impact of poverty and race on our students. So all of the content that they're generating is current, delivered by the foremost experts in our state and tailored specifically to schools. So that's one of the ways we're addressing that particular issue.
Okay, the next one, de-escalation behavior management, safety care training district-wide. Safety care is the system we've gone to, and you can see it in numbers throughout the whole district in terms of fewer and fewer suspensions in general. Safety care is the system that we use for de-escalation of behaviors. And we've been training more and more staff in that. We used to have a different system that was more of a restraint system, but we barely restrain any students physically anymore. and safety care throughout the district. We've been training more and more staff in that. We haven't been able to do it for a year because of the distancing, but we went to this new system. Para-educator training. We've been doing more and more of this, and Dr. Kippenham, do you want to?
Sure, I'd be happy to talk about that one.
Because you've been doing some work in that.
Yep. I'm trying not to say the only good thing that came out of the pandemic anymore. One of the good things that came out of the pandemic was an opportunity to deliver professional development to our paraeducators because we were remote. We were very fortunate to have moved in the direction of an online training system for our paraeducators prior to the closure. And we had purchased the system with the intent of delivering disability-specific trainings to paraeducators across the district because we have so many programs that are tailored specifically to students with autism spectrum needs, with developmental needs, with language-based learning differences. It turned out that the paraeducators had a little bit of time during the pandemic for some extra PD, and there were 120 modules in that training paradigm. And I will tell you that most of our paraeducators accomplished almost 100 of the modules. Though we did not purchase it with that intent, that was one of the benefits of the closure. We were able to deliver quite a bit of paraeducator training.
So we actually have decreased our number of paraeducators in some instances, especially at the high school level. We're relying less on paraeducators and more on skilled teaching. So let me go to the next slide, please. And just Sue, do you want to take this one as well because you've been working on this?
I sure will. So one of the aspects of the evaluation that we certainly knew about and agree with is that while we are incredibly strong in our programming for children with autism, children with developmental disabilities, children with language-based learning disabilities, we have an opportunity for improvement in our support of children with socio-emotional and behavior needs. Having been in the district for more than a couple of years now, our population has changed and we have more children presenting with this need, whereas 10 years ago, there were not as many children presenting with this need. So this year, I've joined the Massachusetts School Mental Health Consortium. That's a group of professionals from around the state that come together and focus on the provision of mental health supports and services within school system. And one of the things that we've been looking at recently is how to train our staff to serve this new population of students that's growing. And we anticipate that when we return in September, we are going to need to do a little bit of restructuring of our services and supports to meet the needs that we anticipate will come out of a possible universal mental health screener. That's something we're exploring implementing this year. So we are developing a system of data taking and a preemptive plan to support the children that we know we're going to find out are going to need a little bit of mental health support. Presently, we have a curriculum, a general education curriculum for wellness. We have some opportunities for mental health services for kids on IEPs, where we are looking to increase service are the kids that are in the middle that don't necessarily have an emotional disability, but will benefit from some support in that area.
Okay, thank you. So the next one, district-wide programmatic meetings targeted to ensure program continuity. We are constantly, every year, looking at our programs. We have moved programs around, not only physically, but we have to look at the populations that we have from year to year. We've had programs that we've discontinued because we just didn't need them anymore. The population was changing. We're getting students with different kinds of needs. So we're constantly looking at that, and we're moving staff around because of that. You know, we're always doing that year to year. Weekly planning times for special education, general education staff. We love to do that, but that's always a struggle to find common planning time. Consideration of alternative building space for the preschool. I think that comes up a lot. Preschool, obviously, I think everyone knows, is still in the high school. Space issues in Braintree are well known. You know, we just have to have the spaces, put the programs where the spaces are. But an example of that with the opening of East, you know, we've moved a lot of programs over there. So that's really helped a lot. The old school had very few programs. Consideration of alternative building space for the, again, for the preschool. I don't know where it would go. It's in the high school. It should really be in an elementary school. But space is a well-known issue in the community. And designated treatment spaces for specialized service provision. We know that sometimes we're providing services in hallways. We're still doing that. I'm not going to go into the space issues in the district. It's well known, but that there are always going to be recommendations at that level about that issue. Could you go to the next slide, please? So staffing recommendations. This is, I mentioned this before, we do not have team chairs at the elementary level, which would change everything. You know, as budgets might loosen up in the years ahead, that's really a critical thing to have, positions to have. Right now, it's just sort of split between a lot of people, those responsibilities. And a lot of times, there's all kinds of meetings going on. These are IEP meetings that have to take place by law, and teachers are you know, people are pulled out, not seeing kids because they're chairing those meetings. And increase BCBA's board certified behavioral analysts. We have 4 of them in district. Those are the positions. That's a discipline where those individuals are putting together behavioral plans, dealing with all kinds of issues that crop up in all of the classrooms. And they talked about increased support at the kindergarten level. At the kindergarten center, we contract out for that to some degree. And, you know, that's just a recommendation if we could ever increase the BCBA position. Consideration of replacing high number of paraeducators for moderate number of certified teachers. As I mentioned before, we've already started to do that. We would rather have fewer paraeducators and more teachers. But, you know, we've chipped away at that over the years since I've been in the district. Now, this is one we've done, which is nice to hear. We got a position of, in the preschool, I call it preschool, but they're calling early childhood program, 3 to 5 year olds. We really had no one, you know, assigned to being the coordinator in that program, but we got that funded last year, and we have a wonderful woman in that position now, and she's full-time. Clinical oversight, supervision, program development, coordination, professional development, and evaluation of district-wide specialists. So clinical oversight, we're doing that, I think, but that's an issue that would, have to be looked at, very carefully and over time. So I'm not going to delve into that because it requires much more in-depth. Now, as I mentioned before, there are, almost 100 pages, I think almost quite 100 pages of these two reports are broken down, and we tried to do it in 10 slides. So with that said, are there any questions that we might be able to answer?
Mr. Chafe, do you have any questions before I dive in?
No, I got no questions on that. The only question I have, the BCBA, you said we have 4 in district
Yeah.
and we need more. How many more I know it's not in our budget, but how many would you be looking to get?
Well, I don't know if I have a number. I would have to really study that, and we would have to come together as a group to determine that. I don't have a number in mind for that, so I don't want to even put anything out there. We might look at a different model. I'm not really sure. So I really wouldn't want to go out on a limb with that at this time.
Thank you. I'm all set, Jim.
Okay, thanks. So first, thank you so much for coming and presenting all of this to us. It's always appreciated to have you guys here, and also everything that you do for the kids in the district is so incredibly appreciated and so valuable. So thank you so much for that. It was quite a comprehensive report. It's always nice to see all the commendation parts in writing. We hear and know that you guys are doing a great job, but it's always nice to see it quantified and written out. The thing that stood out to me in the report is what you talked about in terms of the team chairs being a real need. So, we won't put you on the spot. Just as you said, some evaluation is needed to try to figure out what types of things you might need, but I think it could be good, even though budgets are tight. If it is possible, and I look to Dr. Hackett and Mr. Lee to tell me if this is okay, but I think it would be great if at some point you guys could put something together so that we could get it into the queue or get it in front of the Finance and Operations Subcommittee, even if it's, a bit pie in the sky. Just the way that Dr. Hackett has helped direct our budgets in the past few years. You've seen he always has his tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. So I'd love to have, the needs that you guys have documented and sort of, ready to get into the queue when we're able to do it.
Let me just, can I just comment on that for a second? So in terms of meetings, we have about 1,100 students with IEPs, okay? That means, and everyone has to have an annual review. That's 1,100 meetings right there. We have 180 days. 1,100 meetings right there. Plus we have hundreds of referrals every year for evaluations to determine if a student might be eligible. So several hundred more there. Also, just because, we have those 1,100 students, but sometimes it's more than one meeting. Some students require multiple meetings. So I don't know, I would estimate we're probably close to 2,000 meetings, maybe 1,800 meetings in 180 days. So think of that. And that pulls people out of classes. Team chairs take most of that burden off of them. They have to come into those meetings, but sometimes they only come in for a portion. Say it's the classroom teacher, they might only come in for a portion of the meeting instead of the whole meeting. So the students waiting for them somewhere then get the instruction. It's probably impossible to add up all that time that students are not getting instruction. That's why that's the biggest issue, one of the biggest issues. And if you have I've worked in other districts where they're team chairs. That's their job. They run those meetings efficiently. They run them on time, not that we don't try to. And it's really super, out of this whole evaluation, that's probably the most important thing that the district could take up in years to come, in my view. So not to interrupt it, but just to
Yeah,
make that's the most important thing out of this whole report.
yeah, I mean,
And
it
that
even
comes
stood out to me. So, that number of meetings is wild. So I guess in terms of next steps, it makes me think, how can we get some of these needs documented and, get them in front of the finance committee, get them to the superintendent and assistant superintendent to get them in the queue, just so it's, I mean, we all know how it goes in the professional world and in the education world. You think, well, we'll get to it sometime, but you gotta, I'd like for you guys to have something kind of on paper and on the docket.
I think it might be also worth mentioning to this group that when we do need someone to chair a meeting, it typically comes from the same place, the resources that we use, and it is the school psychologists that are chairing these meetings if we're not able to procure someone somewhere else. And in the upcoming months and near future, we're not going to be able to spare our school psychologists in the same way that we did. So that might be an important facet of
Absolutely.
the process.
And, I certainly won't pretend this isn't something that you guys would have thought of, but I just wondered in reading and listening to you guys, I know we have 2 levels of paraprofessionals. I remember that from our wider collective bargaining days, how we were kind of doing those job descriptions. And, is there, again, naive outsider's perspective, is there any like paperwork or anything that the sort of upper level paras can help with to alleviate the burden that's placed on these people? I'm just thinking about, any creative ways to spread the wealth or lack thereof.
we do in some instances. There's one paraprofessional I'm thinking of in the preschool in particular. I mean, she's a teacher, basically. She takes on that role in many instances. It depends on the level of, the paraprofessionals. Actually, years ago, you used to get a lot of people applying for those jobs, not anymore.
Right.
Because we're paying, I think they start at $16 an hour, maybe less. I don't remember what it is. But I remember this summer, we were looking for paras, and we had many people that just said, no, I'm not coming. Also, other communities around us pay, much higher. So we're finding it when I started, 8 years ago, we had a long list of people that were applying for jobs as paras. Not anymore. We're getting very few. We're getting a lot of young, actually students sometimes, that want to pick up extra money. They're going to school part-time, and we've been able to tap into that a little bit. But that's becoming more of an issue. We would rather, as one of the recommendations is, we have been trading in paras for teachers at certain levels. I think the high school level, 4 paras make a teacher, and we were doing some of that.
So in terms of actual bodies, that works out okay. Then you don't need bodies necessarily more than the skill of a certified teacher.
Yeah, and we have some great paras. We really do. They're dedicated. They just work, very diligently. They're very experienced. But the new people coming in, we're getting less and less because we just don't pay enough. We'll get some prospective teachers that want some experience here or there, but in general, it's getting harder and harder.
Well, and part of that goes along with what Jeff and Milo and Peter have described, that the skill set is evolving, that what we need paras to do is a lot different than what we needed paras to do 10, 15 years ago. So, between the rate of pay that we have for paraprofessionals that reflects 15 years ago and the new needs that we have in order for them to be effective working with kids, there really is a dearth of qualified candidates that we really can fully utilize. And I think the special ed department has done a great job doing exactly what Jeff described in terms of looking at what we have for paras and figuring out ways to make them qualified teachers whose skills really bring to bear a much more effective effort than paras might in a given circumstance. So we can certainly add all of this to our budget deliberations and what we bring forward. I mean, you're all painfully aware of what the budget process will look like. We know these needs exist. The chairs that Jeff has been talking about are common in other districts and would take a lot of burden off of staff that are torn between doing all the legal paperwork that goes into being working in SPED and directly servicing students. So we can certainly bring that back to not only this committee, but finance as well.
I think that would be great. Just have it on the list.
Excuse me, Jen.
Yeah.
If I may.
Please.
Mr. Rubin, how many, I know you mentioned 2 team chairs. How many realistic do we need?
Well, most districts have a team chair in every building. Every place, I've worked in a couple of other districts, I think everyone knows that. I've never worked anywhere where there wasn't a team chair in every building. It's been that way since, well, for many, many, many years, because the burden of the paperwork, the meetings, and as I mentioned in Braintree, we're up to about 22% of our population on IEPs. There's a lot of reasons for that. A lot of districts are, state average is 18%, 18 point something right now. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but because we don't have team chairs, some of the consistency that needs to go on in terms of identification of students for, special services gets spread out too thin. So, we really need that in every building. And there was a recommendation, I think, in Dr. Early's report of having 2 elementary team chairs. But again, we've chipped away at it. We have a team chair at the high school now. We took a teaching position for that, by the way. And we have 2 team chairs at both, one at each middle school. And we were able to chip away at it, to get those positions in there. But again, at the elementary levels, we don't have anyone. So it's just spread out. And you can see in Dr. Early's report, that it sort of is a thread through the whole thing. And you can imagine how much time is taken away from students' instruction because of all these meetings. It's so top heavy in meetings.
In addition, Jeff, if I could just mention, as a teacher, if you have to chair a meeting and you need to bring up a difficult conversation with a parent, try to reduce some services, it really puts the teacher in an adversarial relationship with the parent, which is not a good position to be in as a teacher. So it's very helpful to have a team chair who is the point person initiating that discussion, and it puts the teacher in a position of advocating for the student and being clear and transparent about what the student is able to do or not able to do in the classroom and in terms of recommending services. And then that team chair can have a continuous sort of consistent relationship with the parent through their elementary school experience, establishing that relationship. And that really reduces some of the stress on the teachers when they're in that position.
I just want to add something. Braintree is a tier 1 school district. That means we're pretty much in compliance almost 100% of the time. That's a testament to just this amazing community, I think, with huge support. And, without a lot of staff, I've worked in other communities. It's just a place people like to work in. One of the slides talked about longevity. People want to work here, they live here, they've gone to school here, they're committed to the district. And that's really, an outside evaluation is never going to pick that up. Or maybe not never, but it'd be hard for them to pick it up. You have to work here to understand the commitment of the community. So you know, when you have an outside eval like this, they come in, they don't know the community very well or at all. And we're still a tier 1 community. That means we are almost fully in compliance with all of these hundreds of regulations that are out there for special education, with all this going on. They do it in tiers, meaning, you know, the lower tiers are communities that have real compliance issues. As I mentioned before, we just finished up with our 6-year evaluation just this week. Actually, we'll get that in writing in a couple of months. And the last one we did 6 years, they do it every 3 years, but the major one is every 6 years. The last one, I think there was 1 or 2 space issues. That was it. That was the only thing we were out of compliance with. So I go away with this from my perspective. Braintree does an amazing job because this community just is tight. I don't know how else to explain it. There's always issues, but you know, without all the team chairs and everything else, I think the community does a great job. So anyway, that's all.
It certainly seems like it. We just don't want you guys to get burned out and, you know, have people want to jump ship on you because it's so burdensome. So hopefully.
Nobody's going anywhere.
I'm sorry?
I said, nobody's going anywhere.
Yeah. Jim's locking you in. And actually space issues is one of the questions that I had on my list. So you had mentioned the designated treatment areas. Throwing this year aside, do we think that moving the 5th grade to east and then eventually moving the 5th grade to south, do you anticipate any alleviation of those issues from that? Have you already felt it, or is it?
We're already feeling it in some of the elementary schools because of the east. We moved a whole grade over there, so it's already, you know, happening.
Okay, good. And then my last question is, you had mentioned it would be difficult to develop criteria for out-of-district placement, which makes sense. I was wondering, you know, if you have documentation of other things somewhere, would it be possible to document the process versus the criteria, just so you have something that says, you know, these are the things that we do, even if it doesn't result in a checklist?
Yeah, I mean, it sort of happens because everyone knows, because as I mentioned before, most people have worked here for a long time. They know the process.
Yeah.
Everyone knows each other really well, which makes it a little bit easier. And, you know, once it gets to the level of this child needs a different kind of program, it's very, very clear why. And as I said before, we've been running between 70 and about 75, 76 students in out-of-district placements. As the school committee knows, it's very, very, very expensive for out-of-district placements. And we've developed in-house programs all along the way. We talked about that before in order to avoid that. And we continue to try to be flexible in those areas. When we see a need in an area, you know, we'll ask for support in that area to keep students in district. And most parents want that. They don't want to send their child to an out-of-district placement, you know, sometimes 10 miles away from Braintree or 20 miles away for that matter.
Right. Okay. Are you guys presenting to the full school committee as well? Or just here?
Just here so far.
Okay. I was going to say, if you did come, then we could knuckle the finance and operations committee to take up the mantle of the team chair. So we'll do that with or without you. But again, thank you for coming and for presenting this and for everything that you do. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank the school committee. They've always, since I've been here, just super supportive of special education.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Petra. Thank you, Milo. Please don't feel like you have to stick around, but you're obviously welcome to. Ms. Dolan, I don't know where next on the agenda. You know, obviously you were going a little bit long. There is an item under number 4, the bullying harassment policy.
Mm-hmm.
If you recall, about a couple of years ago through Betsy Devos, they added some new requirements to how sexual harassment cases in schools needed to be handled one of the elements that they added was the school committee needs to vote on whether we as a school system would use the preponderance of evidence or beyond a reasonable doubt as our standard for applying discipline in those cases. So in your packet is the copy of the existing policy. Given the hour and given that that language has not yet been added, we would be advocating for the preponderance of evidence. That is, in essence, it's the standard we've been using for a number of years. We do not take any of those cases lightly. We do, in the high school in particular, I think does an outstanding job doing the due diligence that is required to make sure that everybody is treated fairly, equitably, and most importantly, safely in those circumstances. And over time, that is we have used. But again, the school committee must choose and must vote to choose one of those two standards, preponderance of evidence or beyond a reasonable doubt. I would ask that we consider that, and we can bring back language within that policy that specifies what the committee's will is in that area. But that is something that needs to be voted on this year, so it's on the agenda for tonight.
Okay. So are you looking for direction this evening from the subcommittee in terms of which language to insert?
I would be, because what we'd like to do is update the draft that you have in front of you, include that language, and then bring it, be able to bring it to the school committee as a first reading, so we can expeditiously get this approved.
Okay. So Mr. Chafe, as my only compatriot here, do you have any comments, questions, or thoughts on this issue?
The only thought I have is basically it's got to go to the full committee anyways. Maybe we should just bring it to the full committee and hear them out on it. Because I'm fine with the way we've been doing stuff, but I don't know how everybody else is going to feel.
Yeah, the only other caveat I'd throw in there is since the change in administration at the federal level, there's now talk about removing some of this that Deva's put in. So again, as it stands today, we have to vote one way or the other. But there's movement afoot to go back to pre-Donald Trump era policy as it relates to this. So it might be something we have to revisit the following year as well, too. So I just put it on your radar as something to think about. Certainly happy to bring it to the full committee and have a discussion about it. But again, the committee does have to take a stand.
I would like to, if you're comfortable with it, Mr. Chafe, go forth with a point of view so that the language is inserted in the policy. I don't think that prohibits or inhibits any discussion at the school committee level. We can talk about what the options are and why we're staying consistent in terms of using preponderance, if you are in agreement with that as well. But again, make it clear to the full committee that it's up for discussion.
Yeah, I'm fine with that, Jen, if you want to make the motion.
Okay, so I'll make a motion to include the preponderance language within the draft of the policy and then move it to the full committee.
I'll second it.
Okay, we'll take our vote. Mr. Chafe?
Aye.
I vote aye. So hopefully that gives you what you need, Mr. Lee, for us to have that full discussion.
Thank you very much. It does. It does.
Okay. And I think that concludes, that's plenty, I think, for this evening for this committee. So if anyone has any questions or final thoughts.
With Franco.
Oh, he's here.
He's hiding in
here.
there.
Lurking,
He's
lurking.
He's watching the process, admiring the discussion.
Okay, great. So I'll make a motion to adjourn.
Do we need to set a future date?
Maybe we can do it offline if that's okay. We'll.
That would be great because we have several finance meetings that we're trying to schedule out too. So I'll get back to both of you and Tom as well.
I suspected that was the case, and we also have school advisory board next week, and
Right.
et cetera, et cetera. So we will figure that out soon, Mr. Chafe. And
All right, I second.
okay.
Aye.
I'll vote aye. So I also vote aye. So we are adjourned. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you,
Good
everybody.
night, everybody.
Have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.